It was supposed to be routine. Another hearing, another exchange, another clip destined to disappear into the noise of Washington theater. But then Crockett leaned in and asked one question that didn't sound dramatic at first, almost procedural, almost polite. And that's what made it lethal. Because in that moment, the room shifted. Mike Johnson didn't interrupt. He didn't smile. He paused. And that pause told a story that hours of speeches never could. Viewers felt it instantly. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about exposure, credibility, and a contradiction that had been hiding in plain sight. It began the way so many moments in Washington begin, wrapped in procedural normalcy and dulled by repetition. Another hearing, another round of questions, another expectation that nothing meaningful would break through the static. Most viewers weren't even watching live. Staffers shuffled papers, members leaned back in their chairs, and the assumption hanging over the room was that this would follow the same script it always does. Mike Johnson walked in carrying the quiet confidence of someone insulated by position, accustomed to friendly framing and predictable exchanges. There was no visible tension because no one was expecting confrontation. That absence of anticipation is what made the moment dangerous. Crockett wasn't treated as a disruptor or a threat, which allowed her space to operate without resistance. The environment rewarded complacency. Cameras stayed wide, attention drifted, and the institutional muscle memory of Capitol Hill took over. When systems run on autopilot, they stop scanning for risk. That's when contradictions slip through unnoticed. Johnson was prepared for noise, not precision. He was ready for performance, not accountability. The entire setup functioned like camouflage, disguising what was about to happen as just another forgettable exchange. By the time anyone realized this wasn't routine, the trap had already been set, and the room was no longer controlling the moment. Crockett's demeanor was the opposite of what the room subconsciously prepares for during conflict. There was no edge in her voice, no visible impatience, no rhetorical warm-up meant to signal an attack. Instead, she moved with deliberate calm, the kind that lowers defenses rather than raises alarms. Her pacing was measured, each word placed carefully, as if she were walking Johnson step by step toward a conclusion he hadn't yet recognized. This wasn't hesitation, it was control. By refusing to mirror the confrontational style so often rewarded in these settings, she denied Johnson the opportunity to play a familiar role. There was nothing to push back against emotionally, no tone to criticize, no outburst to reframe as disrespect. That restraint forced the exchange to live or die on substance alone. Viewers watching could sense the intentionality behind it. Calm in this context wasn't neutrality, it was strategy. It suggested preparation, confidence, and an understanding that volume dilutes credibility. The quieter she remained, the more pressure transferred onto Johnson to fill the space with something coherent. Every second she spoke without aggression made it harder for him to dismiss the moment as partisan theater. The calm wasn't passive. It was surgical, designed to invite an answer while quietly removing every escape route that usually comes with political noise. The question landed with an almost deceptive simplicity, the kind that doesn't announce its impact until it's already done its work. Crockett didn't frame it as a challenge or an accusation. She anchored it directly to Johnson's own words and actions, referencing positions he had already taken publicly, positions that were part of the official record and therefore impossible to dispute outright. The phrasing was narrow, intentional, and stripped of emotional language, which forced the focus onto consistency rather than intent. In that moment, the room subtly recalibrated. What had been a general discussion suddenly became specific, and specificity changes the rules. Johnson could no longer rely on broad principles or familiar ideological slogans because the question demanded alignment between past behavior and present claims. That alignment was the pressure point. The brilliance of the question was that it didn't need follow-up context or explanation. Anyone who had even a passing familiarity with Johnson's record could sense the tension immediately. For those who didn't, the pause that followed filled in the gap. The question reframed the entire exchange from a routine hearing into an implicit audit of credibility. It narrowed the lens so tightly that every possible answer carried risk. A direct response invited contradiction. An indirect one suggested avoidance. Crockett didn't rush him, didn't restate the question, didn't soften it further. She allowed it to sit in the open, fully formed and unavoidable. The atmosphere shifted from procedural to evaluative, from passive observation to active judgment. You could feel attention snap into place across the room as people realized this wasn't a rhetorical exercise. It was a test, and it was being administered in real time. The power of the moment came not from drama but from inevitability. Once the question was asked, there was no way to unask it, and no answer that could reset the room back to where it had been seconds before. Johnson's reaction unfolded in fragments rather than words, and that was the first signal that something had gone wrong. He didn't immediately reject the premise or confidently redirect, which is what seasoned figures usually do when confronted with an uncomfortable line of questioning. Instead, there was a pause that stretched just long enough to be noticed. His eyes dropped briefly, as if scanning for a procedural escape hatch that wasn't there, then lifted again toward Crockett with a recalibrated expression. It was the look of someone realizing the terrain had shifted mid-step. When he finally began to speak, the opening words came slower than expected, carefully chosen, almost tentative. This wasn't the cadence of someone delivering a rehearsed defense. It was the cadence of someone buying time. The room picked up on it immediately. That hesitation reframed the exchange before he even reached the substance of his response. Confidence, once interrupted, is difficult to restore under observation. Johnson's posture stiffened slightly, his shoulders squaring as though bracing rather than engaging. The response that followed felt layered, built piece by piece in real time rather than delivered whole. Each clause seemed to test the air before moving forward, suggesting internal calculation rather than conviction. For viewers, this was the moment when the dynamic became unmistakable. The authority he carried into the exchange began to feel conditional, dependent on how well he could navigate what had just been placed in front of him. Crockett's stillness amplified the effect. She didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't offer any signal of approval or resistance. That silence removed external pressure while increasing internal strain. Johnson was now alone with the question, his own record, and the awareness that every second was being captured. The first reaction didn't answer anything, but it revealed plenty. It showed recognition, not confusion, and that distinction mattered. Recognition meant he understood exactly what was at stake, even if the audience was only beginning to realize it. What made the moment escalate was that the record didn't need to be introduced theatrically. It was already there, hovering over the exchange like an unspoken witness. Crockett never had to cite dates or read quotes aloud because Johnson's public positions were well established, familiar to colleagues in the room and easily verifiable by anyone watching later. That familiarity created an unusual kind of pressure. This wasn't a debate over interpretation or intent, but over alignment. The question implicitly asked whether Johnson's current posture could coexist with the positions he had previously defended without qualification. As he spoke, that record functioned as a silent counterpoint, measuring each sentence against what had already been said and done in other contexts. The more Johnson attempted to contextualize, the clearer the disconnect became. Viewers could sense that he wasn't arguing against an accusation. He was negotiating with his own history. Crockett's restraint amplified this dynamic. By not reciting the record herself, she avoided giving Johnson a specific claim to rebut. Instead, she allowed the audience to supply the evidence mentally, which is far more effective. People trust conclusions they reach on their own more than one's handed to them. Johnson's explanations grew longer, more layered, as if complexity itself might blur the contradiction. But complexity only highlighted the problem. The record was simple. His response was not. That imbalance was impossible to ignore. Each attempt to soften or reframe sounded less like clarification and more like insulation. The exchange became a real-time comparison between what had been said before and what was being said now, and the gap between those 2 points widened with every additional sentence. There was no dramatic reveal because nothing was hidden. The exposure came from continuity, from the fact that public records do not forget and do not bend to present convenience. Crockett understood that invoking the record indirectly would force Johnson to contend with it alone, without the relief of external framing. That isolation mattered. It removed the opportunity to blame mischaracterization or partisan distortion. The words were his. The votes were his. The positions were his. All that remained was to reconcile them under scrutiny. The longer the exchange went on, the clearer it became that reconciliation was not coming. As the exchange continued, the most revealing changes weren't verbal at all. Johnson's body began to register what his words were trying to manage. The confident stillness he carried at the start gave way to subtle adjustments that signaled discomfort. He shifted in his seat, repositioned his hands, leaned back and then forward again, as if testing where the pressure was coming from. These movements weren't dramatic, but they were cumulative, and in a room trained to read power, they stood out. Body language has a way of betraying calculation. Each adjustment suggested he was reacting rather than directing, responding to the moment instead of controlling it. Crockett's posture, by contrast, barely changed. She remained upright, composed, and anchored, offering no physical cues that could be used to reframe the interaction as hostile or chaotic. That asymmetry mattered. When one participant is physically steady and the other is visibly negotiating tension, the audience instinctively assigns authority to the former. Johnson's gestures grew more deliberate, his hands occasionally lifting as if to emphasize points that weren't landing on their own. Emphasis without clarity only draws attention to what's missing. His facial expressions tightened at certain moments, a brief narrowing of the eyes, a controlled exhale, signals that the exchange had crossed from routine into effort. Crockett didn't mirror any of it. She didn't nod in agreement or shake her head in disagreement. That neutrality denied him feedback and forced him to continue without knowing whether he was gaining ground or losing it. The cameras captured every micro-adjustment, every pause between movements, freezing them into a visual record that would be replayed later. For viewers, those cues reinforced what the words already suggested. Something was off balance. Body language often communicates truth faster than speech, especially under pressure. Johnson's movements suggested an awareness that he was being boxed in, even if he couldn't yet see a clean way out. The physical tension contrasted sharply with the procedural calm of the setting, making the moment feel heavier than the words alone would suggest. By remaining still, Crockett allowed Johnson's discomfort to become the most animated element in the room, turning his own body into an unwitting narrator of the exchange. When Johnson finished speaking, the absence of sound carried more weight than anything that had been set up to that point. It wasn't an awkward silence or a procedural pause meant to transition to the next speaker. It was a moment where the room collectively registered that something unresolved had just been placed in the open. Crockett did not move to fill it. She didn't thank him, didn't reframe his answer, didn't rush toward the next question. That restraint transformed the silence into a mirror, forcing Johnson's response to stand on its own, without assistance or opposition. In Washington, silence is rarely neutral. It either signals deference or judgment, and this one leaned unmistakably toward the latter. The pause allowed the audience, both in the room and watching remotely, to replay what had just been said in their own minds. Without new information to distract them, listeners were left to weigh coherence against contradiction. Johnson remained still, waiting, but the silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. That duration mattered. It suggested confidence on Crockett's part and uncertainty on his. In that space, the gap between the question and the answer became more visible. The silence acted as an amplifier, magnifying inconsistencies that might have passed unnoticed if the exchange had moved on quickly. Cameras lingered, capturing the stillness, turning it into a visual underline. This wasn't a dramatic stare-down or a theatrical pause. It was procedural calm weaponized through patience. Crockett understood that momentum didn't always come from speaking. Sometimes it came from allowing the weight of a response to settle fully before proceeding. The room's energy subtly shifted as people recalibrated their expectations. What had started as a routine back and forth now felt evaluative, almost judicial. The silence invited judgment without instructing it. Johnson's answer, no longer buffered by immediate reaction, had to withstand scrutiny on its own terms. For viewers, that pause was where realization began to crystallize. It created space for doubt, for re-examination, for the sense that something important had just happened without fanfare. In a political environment saturated with noise, the quiet became impossible to ignore. The silence didn't accuse or explain, but it allowed the implications to surface naturally, making the moment feel heavier, more consequential, and far more memorable than any raised voice could have accomplished. The follow-up didn't arrive as an escalation, which is what made it so effective. Crockett didn't change her tone or posture, and she didn't frame the next question as a rebuttal. Instead, she narrowed the scope, taking what Johnson had just said and placing it against a single, unavoidable point of comparison. Where the first question opened the issue, this one constrained it. The language was even more precise, stripping away any remaining room for abstraction or philosophical detours. It was clear she was no longer inviting explanation. She was testing coherence. By grounding the follow-up directly in Johnson's own response, she removed the possibility of treating it as a separate line of inquiry. He was now boxed in by his own words, forced to reconcile them immediately rather than defer to context or process. The pacing mattered. She didn't rush into it, allowing just enough time for the audience to settle into the implications of his answer before tightening the frame. That sequencing created a sense of inevitability. The follow-up felt less like a new question and more like the logical conclusion of the previous one. Johnson's options narrowed visibly. Acknowledging the contradiction would carry one kind of cost. Continuing to evade it would carry another. Crockett's restraint ensured that whichever path he chose, the tension would remain intact. The question itself was short, almost surgical, and it landed without embellishment. There was no rhetorical flourish to distract from its purpose. By this point, the room understood that this wasn't about scoring a moment but about forcing alignment. Johnson's reaction suggested he recognized that shift. The familiar tools of deflection no longer fit the shape of the exchange. The follow-up had closed the last open door, leaving him with no clean procedural exit. What made the moment resonate was that Crockett didn't signal victory or press for acknowledgement. She simply waited. That waiting underscored her confidence in the structure she had built. The audience could feel the pressure even if nothing dramatic happened outwardly. The exchange had crossed from questioning into exposure, not through accusation but through accumulation. Each element now reinforced the others. The record, the hesitation, the body language, the silence. The follow-up acted as the final constraint, locking all of it into place. From that point forward, the conversation could continue, but the outcome was already shaped. The door wasn't slammed shut with force. It was closed carefully, deliberately, and without spectacle, which made reopening it impossible. Once the constraints tightened, Johnson shifted strategies, and the change was immediate. He moved away from the specifics that had defined the exchange and toward broader language that sounded safer but said less. Principles replaced particulars. Process replaced accountability. It was a familiar maneuver, one designed to lift the conversation out of a narrow lane and back into abstract territory where contradictions are harder to pin down. The pivot wasn't aggressive. It was defensive, marked by an effort to reassert control through generalization. He spoke about intent rather than outcome, about frameworks rather than decisions. In doing so, he avoided directly engaging with the tension Crockett had built, but the avoidance itself became the story. The more he widened the lens, the more obvious it became that he was stepping around something concrete. Viewers could feel the shift in energy. What had been a focused examination suddenly felt like an attempt to reset the board mid-game. Johnson's language grew more polished, more familiar, as if drawn from a well-practiced reserve meant for moments of pressure. That polish contrasted sharply with the precision Crockett had maintained. Where she narrowed, he expanded. Where she anchored, he floated. The pivot signaled that he understood the risk of staying where the conversation was, even if he couldn't neutralize it directly. Each sentence aimed to reframe the exchange as philosophical rather than factual, but the groundwork had already been laid. Abstraction at this stage didn't relieve the pressure. It highlighted it. The audience had already been trained to listen for alignment, not aspiration. Johnson's attempt to recast the discussion as a matter of interpretation rather than record felt reactive, not authoritative. His cadence quickened slightly, as if momentum itself might carry him past the problem. Crockett offered no resistance, which made the pivot feel even more exposed. She didn't challenge the shift explicitly, because she didn't need to. The contrast did the work for her. Viewers recognized the move because they had seen it before, not just from Johnson but from countless figures under scrutiny. That recognition carried its own weight. Defensive pivots rely on the assumption that complexity will exhaust attention. In this case, it had the opposite effect. The distance between the original question and the new framing became impossible to ignore. Instead of diffusing tension, the pivot confirmed it. Johnson wasn't answering a different question. He was signaling discomfort with the one already asked. The attempt to regain narrative control only underscored how much of it had already slipped away. Every word Johnson used to defend himself widened the credibility gap, and it wasn't because of what he said so much as what remained unspoken. Each attempt to clarify or rationalize only drew attention to the discrepancies between his current statements and his prior record. Where alignment should have existed, tension appeared. The audience, trained by years of political commentary and access to public records, could see it clearly. The gap was growing, and it was self-reinforcing. Johnson's phrasing began to sound like careful construction rather than candid explanation. Sentences were layered, often circuitous, as if complexity itself could mask inconsistency. But in high-stakes scrutiny, complexity doesn't obscure. It illuminates. Every qualifying clause, every conditional statement, became another layer that had to be reconciled with what had been previously stated. The cognitive effort required to connect the dots drew attention to the very gaps he was attempting to cover. Crockett didn't need to interrupt or highlight these gaps because their existence was already apparent. Her silence acted as a magnifier. By not interjecting, she forced the audience to supply the analysis themselves, which is far more persuasive than hearing it directly stated. The more Johnson elaborated, the more obvious it became that he was negotiating with his own history, not the question at hand. His voice, calm but increasingly deliberate, underscored the distance between assertion and verification. Each sentence carried the weight of prior contradiction, creating an implicit ledger the audience could read. Even casual viewers sensed it. Credibility isn't only about being right. It's about perceived consistency and reliability. And in this moment, Johnson's reliability began to erode visibly. The tension wasn't manufactured. It was the natural outcome of a mismatch between record and rhetoric. He was trying to reclaim authority while simultaneously contending with a structure that left no room for maneuver. This dual pressure amplified the perception of faltering confidence. Viewers felt it without needing explicit commentary, a visceral recognition that the gap between claim and reality was expanding in real time. By allowing Johnson to talk himself into the void, Crockett created a scenario where the audience actively witnessed the collapse of credibility rather than being told it had happened. Every word became both evidence and reinforcement of the disconnect. The gap wasn't just noticeable. It was unavoidable, and it made every subsequent pause, pivot, and hesitation feel exponentially more significant. It wasn't a single failure, it was the accumulation of small misalignments, each one stacking against him, until credibility itself felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The cameras didn't just capture the exchange. They amplified it, turning every subtle shift into a public record that could be replayed, analyzed, and dissected endlessly. Unlike a private conversation or a closed-door briefing, this moment was performed in full view of anyone willing to watch, but it wasn't performance in the conventional sense. The lenses recorded details that the human eye might miss in real time. The half-second hesitation, the tightening of a jaw, the barely perceptible hand movements. Each frame created an added layer of accountability. Johnson's attempts to navigate the tension were not only verbal but visual, and the cameras ensured that the visual narrative would travel further than the spoken one. Crockett's calm, measured posture, captured in close-ups and wide angles alike, provided a constant contrast. Where he shifted, she remained steady. Where he gestured, she remained anchored. For viewers, these details mattered. The framing of the camera, the lingering on moments of pause, the subtle cuts between reactions, all compounded the effect of the questions themselves. Every glance and every micro-expression was preserved for replay, magnifying the perception of credibility or inconsistency. This wasn't simply documentation, it was a psychological tool. The presence of recording heightened stakes in the moment. Johnson's awareness of the cameras was evident in his careful phrasing, in the way he measured emphasis, in the occasional flicker of uncertainty that might have gone unnoticed in a smaller, unrecorded setting. At the same time, Crockett's confidence appeared more pronounced because it was consistent under scrutiny. The audience could sense the difference between calculated control and reactive maneuvering because the cameras offered an unbroken record. The medium became part of the message. As clips were inevitably shared, slowed down, and analyzed online, small details gained outsized significance. The pause before an answer, the subtle nods or lack thereof, the way words aligned with body language. These elements turned an already tense exchange into a moment with lasting resonance. In real time, the cameras elevated the stakes. Later, they ensured that the moment could not be sanitized or easily reframed. What was said became inseparable from how it was said, and the record of those visual cues reinforced the narrative in ways that no speech could alone. The camera didn't just witness the exchange. It codified it, turning nuance into evidence, hesitation into narrative, and presence into authority. It created a permanent, indisputable context for the conversation, one that Johnson would have to contend with long after the hearing ended, and one that viewers could return to repeatedly, drawing the same conclusions over and over. The visual record itself became part of the momentum, ensuring the story traveled further and landed harder. By the time the exchange had moved past the initial question and response, something subtle but unmistakable had begun to happen. The audience, both in the room and those watching remotely, started to realize what they were actually witnessing. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a dramatic cue, a shouted exclamation, or a glaring admission. Instead, it unfolded gradually, like the slow recognition of a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered across months of public record, past statements, and current claims. Viewers at first might have perceived the exchange as another routine interaction, part of the endless grind of hearings and political theater. But as Johnson's words lengthened, as his pivots grew increasingly abstract, and as the camera captured his micro-expressions and subtle physical shifts, the pattern began to emerge. People started connecting dots in real time, recognizing the tension between what had been promised or asserted before and what was being presented now. The realization was almost visceral. The calm, methodical framing of Crockett's questions forced the audience to act as participants rather than passive observers. Each viewer began mentally checking Johnson's statements against his own record, noting the gaps and inconsistencies. The suspense wasn't manufactured. It was constructed naturally from alignment or the lack thereof. Every pause, every careful inflection, every attempt at reframe became a clue. By the midpoint of the exchange, it was clear to the audience that Johnson was operating defensively, negotiating not just with Crockett's questions but with the unavoidable public record and the perception of those watching. This cognitive shift created a shared understanding between viewers. This wasn't merely a political skirmish or an ideological disagreement. It was a moment of accountability. For the audience, the tension wasn't about partisan allegiance. It was about coherence, credibility, and the failure of one individual to reconcile words with action under pressure. Social media and commentary amplified this recognition almost instantly. Clips began circulating with slowed-down segments highlighting pauses, micro-expressions, and shifts in posture, each one reinforcing the perception that Johnson was caught in a bind of his own making. As the realization set in, viewers became emotionally invested, feeling the weight of the exposure in a way that transcended abstract politics. It wasn't a matter of who was right or wrong, but who appeared to have integrity under scrutiny. Every reaction online mirrored this recognition. Astonishment, incredulity, and the sense of witnessing a rare moment where the optics, the record, and the live exchange converged to reveal an undeniable pattern. By the end of the exchange, the audience wasn't just observing, they were participants in an unfolding narrative of accountability. The cognitive and emotional engagement transformed a technical hearing into a viral moment of public scrutiny, leaving no doubt that this realization, slow to dawn but unmistakable once it did, would define the story moving forward. The turning point arrived not with drama or a sudden confrontation, but with the quiet, almost imperceptible recognition that Johnson had no clean path forward. Up to that moment, there had been room for ambiguity, for abstraction, for strategic maneuvering. He could pivot, qualify, or reframe. But the structure of the exchange, built deliberately by Crockett, had removed all of those escape routes. The first question had opened the issue, the follow-up had narrowed it, and by now the audience and Johnson alike understood that every answer carried consequences. There was no longer a neutral space to occupy, no procedural safety net to rely upon. The turning point was psychological as much as it was factual. Viewers watching could feel the shift in momentum before Johnson did. His language, once fluid and measured, began to exhibit subtle strain. Sentences grew longer, layered with qualifiers, as if complexity could obscure the irreconcilable truth. That realization, the internal recognition that a simple, confident response was impossible, marked the shift from defense to damage control. For Crockett, the moment required no additional effort. Her calm, precise questioning had already done the work. The turning point was amplified by visual cues as well. Micro-expressions, subtle posture changes, and hesitations that had been small indicators became cumulative evidence of a man navigating pressure he could not fully control. Silence between statements took on new weight, signaling both internal calculation and the gravity of the stakes. Viewers, having followed the build-up from the first precise question, now recognized that Johnson's authority was conditional and fragile. Social media reactions and commentary began to reflect this collective realization. The moment was no longer about a policy disagreement or ideological debate. It was about credibility under scrutiny. The audience could feel the inevitability, the sense that the narrative had shifted irreversibly, and that Johnson's options were narrowing in real time. The turning point was also procedural, in that subsequent responses would now be measured not by content alone, but by the audience's perception of alignment with prior statements. Every word, pause, or qualifying phrase became evidence of a gap between intention and record. It was a slow, accumulative moment, but its weight was undeniable. The turning point transformed the interaction from routine oversight into an unfolding exposure. What had started as a normal hearing had evolved into a public reckoning, with the momentum squarely favoring Crockett's controlled strategy and leaving Johnson visibly negotiating the consequences. The audience, having recognized the moment for what it was, now became an active witness to the unraveling of authority in real time, a transformation that would define the exchange long after the cameras stopped rolling. By the time Johnson reached his final attempt to reframe, the exchange had already shifted decisively, and the room and the viewers were attuned to the stakes. This was no longer about defending a policy position or elaborating on intent. It was about salvaging control over a narrative that had, bit by bit, slipped from his grasp. Johnson leaned into familiar rhetorical tools, emphasizing process, intent, and the notion of misunderstanding, hoping to reposition the conversation on safer, more abstract ground. He spoke of principles rather than specifics, of intentions rather than outcomes, and of technicalities rather than public perception. At first glance, it might have seemed like a measured attempt to clarify, but the audience, having followed the buildup of tension, recognized it as a defensive maneuver. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed, as if crafted to deflect criticism rather than address it directly. But this attempt at reframing had little impact on the momentum Crockett had already generated. By structuring her questions with surgical precision, she had narrowed the room for narrative escape. Johnson's abstractions felt like evasion, even if he intended them as explanation. His voice remained calm, but the cadence shifted slightly, revealing the subtle strain of operating under scrutiny. Each sentence, while polished, lacked the decisiveness that would have been necessary to convincingly regain control. For viewers, the disparity between the question's precision and his broad reframing was stark. The contrast amplified the perception of avoidance, highlighting the credibility gap that had been widening for the entire exchange. Crockett, for her part, maintained her composed posture, never interrupting or reacting overtly. Her restraint allowed the audience to judge Johnson's reframing on its own merits or lack thereof. In this way, the final attempt at reframing functioned almost like an unintentional admission, It revealed the pressure he was under and the impossibility of fully aligning his words with his record. Viewers could sense the effort to regain authority without being able to fully succeed, which made the moment resonate even more. The reframing was both the climax of Johnson's defensive strategy and its undoing. It crystallized the audience's recognition that he was negotiating not just the question but the accumulated weight of prior statements, recorded positions, and public perception. Social media and commentary responded immediately, emphasizing the disconnect between his intended narrative and the reality imposed by the exchange itself. This final attempt highlighted the stakes, underscored the control Crockett had exercised, and confirmed for viewers that the narrative momentum had decisively shifted. Every element from word choice to body language to the audience's awareness combined to make this reframing feel less like an explanation and more like a last-ditch effort under unavoidable pressure, cementing the perception that Johnson was cornered in a moment of real-time accountability that could not be undone. Crockett's strategic restraint was one of the defining features of the exchange, and it was subtle enough that many viewers might not have consciously registered it at first, yet its impact was undeniable. She never raised her voice, never gestured emphatically, and never interjected to highlight the weaknesses in Johnson's responses. Instead, she maintained a composed, almost meditative presence, letting the tension build naturally through the structure of her questioning and the responses she elicited. This was intentional. Every pause, every carefully measured question, and every moment of silence was a calculated decision designed to maximize pressure without resorting to overt confrontation. By remaining restrained, she transferred the burden of explanation entirely onto Johnson, forcing him to navigate not only the question, but also the accumulated implications of his own record, prior statements, and public persona. The effect was twofold. It magnified any missteps and simultaneously reinforced her authority in the room. Viewers could sense the contrast immediately. Where Johnson's language became abstract, defensive, or circuitous, Crockett's calm certainty made her appear in control, even without saying a word. Her restraint also prevented the moment from being dismissed as partisan theatrics. She wasn't raising her voice to score points. She was allowing the natural momentum of accountability to play out, letting Johnson's words and omissions speak for themselves. This created a psychological dynamic in which the audience became complicit, actively processing and internalizing the tension without overt cues. The structure of the exchange, combined with her restraint, ensured that every defensive maneuver by Johnson only reinforced the narrative Crockett had set in motion. The restraint also had the effect of sustaining suspense. The audience felt the weight of the moment precisely because she refused to fill in gaps with commentary or reaction. Every hesitation, every pivot, every micro-expression became evidence, amplified by the contrast of her steadiness. In this way, Crockett's restraint was not passivity, it was tactical, amplifying impact while maintaining control over pacing and perception. It created a scenario in which the audience, the record, and the visual cues all worked together to highlight Johnson's difficulty in responding effectively. By consciously avoiding escalation, she allowed the interaction to unfold in a way that seemed natural and unforced, yet it was meticulously structured. Viewers could sense the inevitability of the exposure without her having to explicitly declare it, making the moment feel authentic, unscripted, and unavoidable. Every element, the calm voice, the unbroken posture, the silence, and the precise follow-up worked together to reinforce the perception of authority, turning strategic restraint into a tool that subtly but powerfully ensured that Johnson's words and actions were under relentless, unmediated scrutiny. Crockett's measured approach made the audience feel as though they were witnessing the collapse of a narrative from the inside, observing a figure navigate pressure he could neither escape nor fully control. The restraint itself became part of the narrative, a force shaping the story without overtly announcing its presence, cementing her control over the exchange and the audience's perception simultaneously. The aftermath began the moment the exchange concluded, and it unfolded faster than anyone in the room could fully process. As Johnson stepped back, the immediate silence that had defined the final seconds of the hearing was replaced by a different kind of noise, an almost instantaneous ripple of recognition that this was not a routine moment, but one of exposure and consequence. Cameras, still rolling, captured the final glances, the subtle adjustments, and the lingering tension, preserving them for anyone who would later encounter the clip. Within minutes, segments were being clipped, shared, and circulated online, spreading beyond the confines of the hearing room to social media platforms, commentary shows, and news sites. Viewers replayed the exchange, analyzing pauses, tone, phrasing, and body language, and in doing so, the subtle nuances that Crockett had deliberately allowed to persist now took on amplified significance. Every hesitation, every qualifying phrase from Johnson, every silent response from Crockett became evidence for audiences to dissect. The speed at which the aftermath unfolded reinforced the gravity of the moment. What might have been a contained exchange became a public narrative almost immediately. Commentary and online discussion didn't simply summarize the interaction. They dissected it, highlighted contradictions, and compared it to Johnson's historical record, reinforcing the perception of misalignment between words and actions. The visual record, amplified by the immediacy of digital distribution, created a feedback loop. As clips circulated, more viewers tuned in, revisiting the exchange frame by frame. Each replay reinforced the narrative momentum, transforming a single procedural hearing into a viral moment of political scrutiny. The audience's engagement was heightened because Crockett's approach had left gaps for interpretation, gaps that viewers could fill themselves, which made the scrutiny feel participatory. Johnson's defensive pivots, reframing attempts, and micro-expressions became the story rather than just the supporting details, and social media amplified each of these elements, turning them into talking points, memes, and discussion threads. Analysts began weighing the implications, projecting potential consequences for credibility, public perception, and political leverage, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate room. The aftermath was cumulative. Every viewing, comment, and analysis layer built upon the prior, solidifying a narrative that was difficult to contest because it relied on the record itself rather than interpretation. Crockett's strategic restraint, the precise questioning, the silence, and the visual cues all coalesced into an enduring moment of exposure. The immediate aftermath transformed the exchange from a live event into a living, circulating story that shaped perception long before any official statements or clarifications could intervene. In effect, the audience became an active participant in processing the consequences, and the moment, once fleeting, began to take on lasting significance, defining both Johnson's credibility and Crockett's effectiveness in the public eye. This moment resonated because it felt unmanufactured, almost accidental in its authenticity, even though it had been carefully orchestrated in terms of structure and timing. Viewers could sense the difference immediately. It wasn't a staged soundbite or a moment designed for viral consumption. It was a real-time unfolding of accountability in a setting where such clarity rarely appears. Crockett's questions were precise but not theatrical, her delivery calm but deliberate, and that combination created a contrast that magnified the impact of every word, pause, and gesture from Johnson. The audience was drawn in not by outrage alone, but by the natural tension between what was being said and what was left unsaid, between past statements and present answers. Johnson's hesitations, pivots, and attempts to reframe highlighted the difficulty of aligning words with record under scrutiny, and that struggle was tangible to anyone watching. Unlike moments engineered for shock value, this exchange relied on the accumulation of evidence, behavioral cues, and the inherent structure of the questioning to build impact, which made the resonance feel earned rather than forced. It tapped into a collective familiarity with the mechanics of accountability. Viewers understood intuitively when someone is operating defensively, when evasions signal underlying inconsistencies, and when authority has been challenged without theatrics. The resonance also came from the participatory nature of the moment. By structuring the exchange in a way that allowed the audience to supply their own analysis, Crockett engaged viewers' critical faculties, making them active participants rather than passive observers. Social media amplified this effect, as clips were circulated, scrutinized, and discussed almost instantly, turning subtle shifts in tone or posture into widely recognized indicators of credibility, or the lack thereof. Beyond the immediate political implications, the moment resonated because it crystallized a broader pattern in American politics. The tension between public accountability and personal narrative, between carefully curated statements and the unavoidable reality of past actions. Viewers recognized that this wasn't just about one hearing, one question, or one individual. It was about the mechanisms of exposure, credibility, and public perception in real time. That recognition created a sense of emotional engagement, as audiences felt both the weight of the accountability being exercised and the consequences for someone caught in its net. The resonance persisted precisely because it was subtle, layered, and authentic. It wasn't reduced to a single line or a viral clip. It unfolded cumulatively, with every pause, gesture, and word adding to the narrative. This made the moment compelling, relatable, and undeniable, leaving an impression that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. It spoke to the audience's desire to see clarity and consequence in spaces often dominated by noise, ensuring that the moment would be remembered and discussed far beyond the immediate hearing, shaping perception in ways few routine exchanges ever do. What made the stakes moving forward so consequential was that the exchange had already crystallized in a way that could not be undone. Once Crockett's question landed, Johnson's responses, every hesitation, every pivot, every attempt at reframing became fixed elements of the public record. The audience, having witnessed the moment unfold in real time and through subsequent circulation online, had already begun forming judgments that were difficult to challenge. The stakes were no longer hypothetical. They were immediate, measurable, and cumulative. Every clip, every replay, and every analysis reinforced a narrative that Johnson's credibility had been tested under pressure, and that test had left gaps difficult to reconcile. In politics, moments like this carry forward far beyond the room where they occur. Johnson's future statements, policy positions, and public appearances would now be filtered through the lens of this exposure. Every word he utters will be measured against the clarity and precision of the exchange, with the audience instinctively comparing what is said today to what was revealed in that hearing. Crockett, by contrast, reinforced her position through structure, restraint, and focus, giving her a visible aura of authority that would carry through subsequent interactions. The stakes extend beyond perception alone. They influence strategy, messaging, and the leverage of all parties involved. Political opponents, analysts, and media commentators now have a clear reference point. The moment functions as both precedent and evidence, a yardstick against which future credibility and alignment can be measured. The intensity of the scrutiny is compounded by the viral nature of the exchange, as digital distribution ensures that it continues to circulate, reaching audiences far removed from the original hearing. Each replay acts as reinforcement, not just for the audience's perception of Johnson, but also for the narrative of accountability Crockett established. The exchange also redefines what it means to be caught in real-time scrutiny. In the past, evasions, pivots, and abstract defenses could be absorbed or reframed with sufficient messaging or spin. Here, the careful orchestration and cumulative buildup prevented those maneuvers from fully restoring authority. Moving forward, the stakes include trustworthiness, public perception, and long-term political capital. Johnson's ability to command credibility in future debates, hearings, or policy discussions is now constrained by what was revealed in that exchange. For Crockett, the stakes are about establishing a reputation for precise, disciplined questioning that leaves little room for deflection. For the audience, the stakes are in recognizing the dynamics of power, accountability, and exposure as they play out in real time. Every subsequent interaction will be viewed through the prism of this exchange, making the moment a pivotal reference point in ongoing political discourse. The long-term consequence is that control over narrative, once lost or challenged in this manner, is extraordinarily difficult to reclaim, and the audience has now been trained to spot the misalignment, hesitation, and defensive maneuvers that define moments like this. The stakes moving forward are both immediate and enduring, shaping perception, strategy, and credibility in ways that will reverberate far beyond the original hearing.